Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next hour. And my really extra special guest needs no introduction at all because he is here by the fulsome and muscular demand of Goldster members. And if they ask, we do or we try to. Therefore, I'm going to abandon my usual higgledy-piggledy introduction of my remarkable, fascinating, and high-achieving fellow presenter, except to say that if any of you in the wonderful audience have got a question that you want to put in that chat, just put them in, keep them flowing, because this is our one time to find out who is the man behind the smile. Welcome, Alastair Hignell, Goldster, Purpose, Passion and Grit.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Humphrey. Nice to see you.
Yeah, well, no, you're the founder of Purpose, Passion and Grit. It's not a bad show, is it?
It's pretty good. I enjoy doing it every month or so, and I've been lucky enough to have still got some of my old contacts in sport and been able to speak to and hear about some extraordinary lives of people who really have demonstrated passion, purpose, and grit. So it's a lovely idea, and it's great to be part of it.
Yeah, it is. It's been and we just keep going on like the guy with the ball getting to the other end of the field.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask, because I'm sort of do the politics more, foreign stuff,
Yeah.
and the world. Everybody says the world's in upheaval. You're a sports guy, so you might have your tussles on the pitch, but tell us where sport in our minds fits into all this turmoil.
Well, sport is very important to an awful lot of people, and it provides the light and shade in a lot of people's lives. It provides excitement, thrills, and enjoyment, and camaraderie, and friendship, and all of those sorts of things. But it isn't real life. Whatever you say about it, it's not real life. There's some awful things going on in the world. We've just had a World Cup in rugby, which is the highest pinnacle you could get to in that particular sport.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it pales into significance with what's happening in the rest of the world. However seriously we take it, however seriously the fans take it, the journalists, the commentators, and so on, it's not, thankfully, the real thing.
It does, doesn't it, though, bring people together of different cultures, different tribes, whatever you might want to call it? Because I and you, although I didn't know this until today, were in Australia at the same time when you made your debut. Now, you were a young man then, I was a young man then, and I was a POM, British, English, and you were a POM, English. Just tell us about bringing people together and what happens on the pitch. There was a tussle there.
My memories of that tour are very clear. I was a 19-year-old first-year undergraduate at Cambridge University, asked if I'd like to go on tour to play with England in Australia. I had to fiddle about a bit, beg time off from the college I was at, but they let me go. So I had a month in Australia as part of an England setup. So the thrill and excitement of being a 19-year-old playing with guys you've seen on the telly, and they're your heroes, and suddenly I'm in this thing. But the other thing that we all noticed when we got to Australia was that pommies were not exactly flavour of the month. They blamed us for everything. They blamed us for all the strikes. Your bloody trade unionists over here, mate, we've got strikes. That's all because of you pommy bastards. And you say, no, it wasn't really to do with us. And they blamed the pommies and the Labour government and all their problems. They seem to be blaming it on us. I was, you read the newspapers and you get that impression. And for whatever reasons, and whether that had something to do with it, we discovered on the field that the Australian attitude was incredibly, for those days, brutal, uncompromising, dirty, whatever. We had lots of players injured. We had pretty naughty things going on in the front row, the Australian front row. Our manager made a complaint. The Australians, my debut, the second test, in Brisbane, there was a punch up from the kickoff. It was a really stoked up, fired up, you pommy bastards, we're out to do you. And yes, the atmosphere, having been to Australia a fair few times since, there's a certain amount of tongue in cheek about calling someone a pommy bastard. But when you first go there and it all seems this upfront aggression, and the political side of it. It was all our fault. They had trade union problems and things like that. Yeah, it was very, very strange, surprising, and yeah, it was a fantastic experience.
It was, but let me ask, because I played rugby at school. I didn't go on to have an illustrious career like you, but it's a fairly, what you would say, tactile game. How do you know when somebody's tackling you or trying to get the ball off you, when somebody's actually giving you a punch in the kidneys?
Well, I mean, the great thing about rugby when it first started in the 19th century, famously, William Webb Ellis at rugby school picked up a football and ran with it. That was how the game began. And in Victorian times, it was all about codifying and giving things rules and names and things. And sport got that. They got the rules, and therefore rugby and football and all the other sports evolved with a framework of rules and a sort of understanding in the early days that, I mean, first early matches, they didn't bother with referees because the chaps would know how to play the game. And if somebody did something that was against the spirit or the laws, they'd hold their hands up and the other side would have a go. So referees were late to the game, but the idea was there was this framework that, you know, almost like it's not quite a spiritual thing, but it was, you followed the rules, you did what was allowed, you did, you know, you tackled below the waist, there was a code, I suppose, that meant that we all tried to follow the rules. The referee was there to interpret them, and there was the odd bit where if you felt, not me particularly, but if one of our team felt that the other side had broken the rules, then they would sort of take some sort of retribution. If you continue cheating, we'll give you a little tap, that sort of thing. That was the sort of accepted way of doing it back in the 70s.
And historically, what came first, soccer or rugby?
Soccer, really. Well, there's some ancient games that were called football of various sorts, and they get celebrated around the country. There's one in Ashbourne on Shrove Tuesday, for instance, but it's sort of getting a ball from one end of the town to the other. So it's a sort of mix of rugby, and there's the Eton Wall game, and there's all sorts of sports that have evolved from that. But there was a game that was soccer, but it included hacking and all that sort of thing. And the Victorians, they've invented the rules for all of those sports in an extraordinarily short space of time. Tennis came along, badminton, soccer. They codified, gave rules, just as they were codifying botanical species and biological species. They codified sports and games, and then they said about giving them rules and things that everybody would abide by.
And just before we leave Australia, the Australians are still, I mean, in the cricket the other day, they were being castigated for not so much cheating, but not playing by the spirit of the game.
Well, that charge has been levelled against England many times by the Australians as well. Yes, the caricature, and therefore it's almost a self-imposed caricature of the Australians is, we're bloody hard to beat. We don't give any side. We play it tough and against up to the level of the rules, and that's the way we play it. And we don't expect it, any quarter given or taken and all that sort of stuff. And they have their code, which they sometimes feel that we have broken or the other side have broken. So you can play hard but fair, but that's always needs somebody to define exactly which side of hard and which side of fair you are. But yeah, the Australians love their sport. They have a fantastic country, outdoor life. They've got swimming pools, and they've got the facilities and the space and the sunshine to play lots and lots of sport, and they play it incredibly passionately, and they play it successfully as well.
And they have Australian rules as well, which is rugby where you throw the ball forward, isn't it?
Yeah, and kick it forward. Yeah, well, that's the interesting part in the sense that when we went to Australia way back in 1975, we discovered that rugby was actually the fourth most important sport. There was cricket, there was rugby league, there was Australian rules, and rugby union was only played really in Sydney and Brisbane, few in Canberra, a bit in Perth. But really, it was very much the junior cousin to Australian rules football, and particularly to rugby league. So the Australians have a different perspective on that. It's one of many sports. It has to compete against the other code of rugby league, which, you know, is very strong and big in the UK, but is basically geographically contained in the northern counties. And rugby union is a more global game. That more countries play it. But in Australia, they have a tough battle against the other sports, which will give them a problem. They're holding the Olympics. No, they're holding a Lions tour and the next World Cup. And they really need, and the Australian team had a bad World Cup this time, they really need to get on board with it to make it an Australian event.
So now I want to take us right back from way before you went to Brisbane in 1975. At what age were you when you knew that you wanted to do sport? You didn't want to become an astronaut or a doctor or an engineer. You wanted to be a sportsman.
I was incredibly lucky to have, my dad was an international athlete. He threw the javelin for Great Britain back in the 50s. He went on a fantastic Commonwealth Games, Empire Games, they call it then, in 1950 trip by boat to compete for Britain for England in the Commonwealth Game, the Empire Games in Auckland in 1950. He was an athlete. He loved his sport. When I grew up, I hero worshipped my dad. I could go and watch him play cricket, could go and watch him throw the javelin, and I was one of 5 kids, and I think they discovered that actually if they could get one of the kids off with dad when he went off to play his cricket, it was a bit easier to look after the rest. So I went with my dad from a very early age, carried his bag, just imbibed the whole atmosphere. I worked the scoreboard, I put up the scores, I even scored in the book. I just wanted to be there. And, you know, you had a chance of throwing the ball at some of the men, and they very kindly threw a ball back at you, and you sort of went, oh, sport, yeah, I want to do this. And so I think it was there. My dad was this hero.
He was your hero figure, was he? That
yeah. And then I went to a school. I went away to a boarding school at age 7, which sounds a lot crueler than it actually was. But my dad was in the forces, in the RAF. He was posted abroad. It made sense to send me along with my slightly older brother, a year older, to prep school at the same time. And we've got to prep school, and there wasn't much else to do other than sport. Yeah. We had a very inspirational headmaster who had been a British and Irish Lion back in 1955. So, and rugby was the sport you played 2 terms a year, and cricket was the sport you did the other one. And I just loved playing them, loved competing, had fantastic teachers that encouraged me. They said, you can, aim for the best, try and be the best you can. And yeah, I was lucky enough. I had a good eye for a ball. I was so determined. I was so, I'd the ball against the wall all through the holidays and that sort of thing.
Were you in the school team? So you were you represented your school in all these. You played other schools, presumably.
Oh yes, I was. I was in the under-11s at 8, and that sort of stuff. And the first 11 cricket for 5 years. That yes, you got the glory of amongst your peers, and there is in prep schools and boarding schools and those sorts of institutions, there is this idea that the sports teams are elevated in general esteem by everybody, and so to be on all of the teams and to be doing quite well on them, obviously helped me. You became a symbol and a young hero to the others. Now tell me, whilst all this was going on the rugby pitch, the cricket pitch, and all the rest of it, presumably you were also being taught maths and Latin and history and that sort of thing. How did you do in all that? Well, I went up to school at the same time as my elder brother, and one of my sins is I was ferociously competitive. So I was a 7-year-old in with a bunch of 8-year-olds, one of whom was my brother, and I had to be as good as them or better than them. So the competitive element was there, and they had this barbaric practice in schools in those days of reading out your marks at the end of term and what position you were in and all this sort of thing. And so just imagine, you're desperate to be read out in the top 3 or top 1 or whatever. So your competitive juices are firing away. And I seem to have a good a good memory. I was so determined to conquer everything, to beat everybody, to be the best, the brightest, the quickest, the fastest. And I had this drive, and there were lots of people, my brother was one, and friends and so on. And you had this inbuilt thing, and the school was great. There was nothing, there's no social life or anything. You're away in a boarding school, locked up in the Staffordshire countryside. And, you could do sport, you could read your books, no girls or anything like that around to distract you at all. And if you concentrated on the things that were there, you could derive fantastic benefit from them, because you had very encouraging teachers, and you could get yourself to a certain, a long way. And that's,
so you excelled in the sports thing, but you were also excelling as a SWAT, as the top of the. So you went through all that, and you then applied and got into Cambridge. What did you study at Cambridge?
History.
Why?
Well, again, this hero worship thing. My dad was a doctor, and
right.
I grew up, my early years, I was going, I'm going to follow my dad. I'm going to be a doctor like my dad. Seems to give him a bit of time to play cricket. But I was going to do that. And then I realized that actually biology at my public school, Denston, I wasn't very good at doing the drawing bit. And and I had a teacher who was so on my case that I said, right, I had a little teenage strop. I'm not going to do biology. I'm not going to do that. And I loved the history, and I had a good memory. I had really good memory, so I could remember facts and stories, and and so I thought, oh, this is the subject I'd like to do. And again, you get I had two inspirational history teachers who had a great oratorical style, but a great way of telling the stories of history. And I thought, blimey, that's good. I'm going to be a history teacher, because you get time off in the summer, and I can play some sport in the summer, and that sounds a good life. So right from an early mid-teens, I suppose, I was going, I'm going to go to Cambridge, read history, be a history teacher, and play some sport alongside it. What could be a better life than that? That was my sort of teenage ambitions.
And was there a period of history that captured your imagination?
Not really then, although now I'm very interested in the Victorians and the amateur era, sport and history, Victorians, and how sport evolved into what it is now.
That's why you knew so much about it.
Well, yeah, but my answer, one of my great uncle, I think he was the secretary to the Viceroy of India. And so when we stayed with my grandma or whatever, there were all these artifacts, and her husband, my grandfather, had been a district commissioner in Tanganyika, which is now Tanzania. And so there were all of these artifacts around, and the histories of daring and, serving your country, your empire in exotic foreign lands. So, those were motivation factors as well. That's, I wanted to serve in some sort of way, but history was the thing I liked most and got most satisfaction out of. So I thought I'd try and read it at university.
And you got in before I pick into your university career and how you went on sports. Geeta says, if you hadn't been a sportsman, what career would you have liked to follow? That hadn't been as sort of, after what you've told us, an impossibility, but let's speculate.
Well, if I hadn't been a sportsman, I'd have probably gone straight into teaching. Because in a sense, your careers are mapped out for you, and there's a lot of problems. For instance, for my kids' generation, they had all sorts of possibilities opening up to them. In my era, and people of my time, I think there was this expectation that you did your O levels, you did your A levels, you went to university, you got a good job, and it kept you going for the rest of your life. And you just had to find a good profession to get on the track of. I wasn't going to be a doctor because I couldn't do the biology, so I was going to be a teacher, and that was going to be
which why don't we go to that? Which you were, weren't you, for a number of years, weren't you?
Yeah. On my first before I went up to university, I did a term's gap year, sort of gap year. It was only 6 months, but I did a term's teaching at a prep school, and then after university, I did my teacher's training course, and after university, I taught at Bristol Cathedral School for 7 years on a part-time basis, or was it 5 years, where I taught for 2 terms and played cricket for the other term. And then I took a full-time job at Sherborne Public School in Dorset, where I taught for 2 years full-time before the lure of the bright lights or the dusty microphones got hold of me, and I got a job in BBC Radio.
Now, long before that lure of the bright lights gets you, you're at Cambridge. Did you basically repeat at Cambridge what you were doing at school? You were highly competitive, both academically and on the sports field.
Yeah, I mean, by that time, I was incredibly fortunate, I suppose, in that the school I was at encouraged us to aim beyond just playing on the school circuit. So there was a fantastic guy who was the coach for the talent spotter, I suppose, for Eastern Counties under-19 schools. And he sent something round, and somebody put it up on our notice board. I was living in Cambridgeshire at the time. My dad was at RAF Hospital Ely, but I was at school in Staffordshire. But this notice appeared and said, if you want to play holiday rugby, sign up here, approach this guy. And this guy called Percy Morgan drove all the way from Essex up to Denston to watch me play in a game. And there was one other guy who also applied in the same way, and went back with some information. And during that summer, next holidays, I got invited to play for Cambridgeshire and then Eastern Counties under 19s or whatever it was. And so that fired, gosh, I can do this. I'm in that sort of era. I went up to, I then was also very successful on the sports field, the cricket field. So I was playing cricket and scoring lots of runs, and got selected to play in an England schools trial and managed to get in the England schools side. And I got in the England schools rugby side because people encouraged me to do so. And so I went up to Cambridge, already a double international at rugby and cricket at schools level, and had already had a term at summer at Gloucestershire as a professional cricketer. So I sort of thought, I can do this sport. How about getting the studying sorted out alongside it? And I had very generous people who sort of said, well, you can do some work then, you can do some work. No, we fiddled around so that I could play my sport at both levels and do my assignments, my essays, my lectures, that sort of thing.
So but before I hear more about the sport, did you then leave Cambridge with a double first in history, or?
No, I realized early on that because I was spending a bit of time on various sports fields, I realized that maybe aiming for a first was going to cause a lot of hassle for everybody. So I did, they call it the sportsman's degree, but I think that's harsh word. I made sure that I did the right sort of work to make sure I passed without ever having the time or the opportunity to do the high-flown research and the extra bits you need to do to get a first. So I got a 2-2 and qualified to do the teacher's training course the next year and passed that. And so left Cambridge with a BA, which, do you know that, at Cambridge, you do a BA and 3 years later they give you an MA.
Oh, what, automatically?
Yeah, I think you have to stay alive for 3 years and the BA becomes an MA.
But you said that's called the sportsman's degree. I mean, everybody talks about it like that.
2-2, yeah. Well, the
2-2 is the sportsman's degree.
Yeah.
But if you get your sportsman's degree and you don't become an international, then you sort of flunked a bit, haven't you?
Yeah.
So tell me, you were going through this young period, being so successful. Was there a lot of envy around then, Alastair? Were people sort of thinking he's too big for his boots, or did you have a huge mass of friends around you?
I don't think so. I mean, I think rugby and cricket were such sociable sports, and maybe I'm a sociable bloke, but I just, you went to the college bar and said, "Hi, mate, how's it going?" and so on, and you just had your friends there. And at the weekend, you played for Cambridge, and they came down and watched. And then you got onto that. So you went on a tour with England, and they all sent congratulations on. But you go back and you're in the college bar again on the next available occasion, and everybody goes, "Oh yeah." They might say, "God, you were awful last week," or "I don't watch the game, you were rubbish." But it was all. I think Cambridge, and I'm sure lots of universities had some high achievers in. There were some high achieving people around, and great teachers, great lecturers, professors, and so on, people who were used to being in the public eye, but also being fated for being good at what they do. So, it just seemed to be
and tell us
an atmosphere of excellence and accepting that excellence can be achieved.
And describe it a little bit in these two sports. In fact, before I ask you this question, there's a bit of, I don't know if it's from a press release or something I saw on the Goldster website. Alastair Hignell was a throwback to an earlier era when multi-talented sportsmen could excel in more than one field. Did you write that? Is that, I mean, because you did do these two things at an international level, didn't you?
Yeah, well, not quite international cricket, but near.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I always describe myself as a dinosaur, simply because my species is extinct. You're not going to be able to play two sports at the highest level because all sports have now become 12-month-a-year events or activities. Rugby was very amateur. Cricket was only just professional. They had defined seasons. So the rugby season would start at the beginning of September, which is roughly when the cricket season ended, and it would end middle of April, which was roughly when the cricket season started. So you could fit them in and not miss out on too much. There wasn't such a thing as pre-season training then, which probably would have prolonged my sporting career a lot better if I'd actually indulged in pre-season training. But on the other hand, if I'd indulged in pre-season training, I wouldn't have been able to play the other sport. So I played a lot. I lurched from cricket field to rugby field to cricket field to rugby field, and managed to fit them all in, managed to luckily be selected at these high levels. And it was a merry-go-round. And with the accent on the merry, you were on this fantastic thing. Where am I this week? Oh, I'm playing for England. Next week, I've got to do my university degree or exam. Oh, there's some cricket to play. And I just accepted it and went for it.
I mean, I've got on this thing that you had a brutal encounter, the one that we discussed in Brisbane. 8 days later, you were playing for Gloucestershire against Middlesex.
Yeah.
And then 5 weeks after that, you were playing in varsity matches.
Yeah.
Yeah. What a life you had.
Well, it was, I mean, but I was too young and naive to, somebody wants me to, but I got back from the tour to Australia to a phone call from Gloucester saying, we're a man short, we've got a game, you are technically on our staff, we've got a man short, you're not going to be in the varsity side because you've missed half the season. Can you come up and help us out? So I said, and played a Sunday league game, went back to Cambridge because Gloucestershire said, we need you back. You're not going to get a blue in the varsity match. Can you come back? So I went and found that Cambridge were playing a game. I went where they were playing a Wednesday game to speak to the captain. Said, look, captain, I can see you've established your team. You're going to be working up to the varsity match. So if it's all right with you, I'll go back to Gloucestershire and play cricket for them. And he said, don't go yet because we've got an injury. Can you just play today? So I played and I scored some runs and stayed in the varsity side. But it was that sort of happy accident, lucky accident that allowed me to get 4 blues at cricket and 4 blues at rugby.
Fantastic.
Because you got there.
And in rugby, what position did you play?
Well, again, there's a little story to that. And I played for England schools as a scrum half. I played for Bristol. Right.
That's the little guy that
little guy, number 9,
scrum and passes it to the fly half. Is that right?
That's my natural milieu. But unfortunately, when I got to Cambridge, I went to Cambridge as a guy who'd played first-class rugby for Bristol as a scrum half, but I played first-class cricket for Gloucestershire. My career was going to be a cricketer first and a teacher second. So I went up and said, I'll play a bit of part-time rugby whilst I'm here. Cambridge had a crisis at fullback, and they said, have you ever played fullback? I said, no. Do you want to play fullback? Give it a go. Played in a trial and was catapulted into the Cambridge first team, which had a very successful year. So I suddenly got a blue and I didn't expect one.
As a fullback?
As a fullback, yeah.
As opposed to scrum half, yeah.
Having played 6 or 7 games. And then England picked me to go as a fullback to Australia. So I thought, oh, maybe I am a fullback. And that's where I won my international caps. But by inclination, trade and size, because I was a short little bloke, I was a scrum half.
And cricket, what was your best positions in cricket?
Well, I was a batsman. I was very successful at schoolboy level as a batsman. I didn't really have a classical technique, so I had a very good eye for a ball and concentration and competitiveness and that sort of thing. So I did well at schoolboy level. Gloucestershire gave me a contract, and I was a sort of, I never opened the batting. I was a sort of middle order, lower middle order batsman from them who could also field a bit. I discovered that I was quite a good fielder and catcher and that sort of thing, and was able to be a middle order batsman. For Cambridge, I would be 3, 4, 5. For Gloucestershire, I'd be 4, 5, 6 in the order.
Okay, yeah,
and was scored enough runs to keep a place for best part of 10 years.
Geeta, who I now remember was the pioneer Goldster member who demanded your presence in a show like this. Geeta's got a number of questions, but the first one I think is a very good one because I never allow assumed knowledge. Sorry, I'm not sporty. What is a blue, please?
A blue is when you represent Cambridge or Oxford against the other one. It's a blue. The dark blues are Oxford, the light blues are Cambridge, and when you play in the varsity match, you are entitled to call yourself a blue and to spend a lot of money on buying blues blazers and blue ties and bow ties and cummerbunds and all of those sorts of things. But you can only be a blue if you play in the varsity match. So you might play 12 games leading up to the rugby varsity match in December, be injured, and you can't call yourself a blue.
And you can get a blue for any of those varsity matches, rowing or
well, they grade it. They did grade it quite a lot. So there are some senior sports for which you get an automatic full blue. There are some sports for which you get a half blue. There are some now which apparently you get a quarter blue for, and there are various gradations. And if you win your match in some of them, you go from half blue. It's a very complicated.
Yeah, and I wondered, I don't even know if they have something like darts, which doesn't really, whether they have a blue for that.
One of the times when I was captain of one of the teams, they said, we want you on the blues committee. And the blues committee, we met in a pub. So no, we didn't. We met in obviously a fine meeting room, and decided what should constitute a blue. Because every sport says, well, we should be a full blue or a quarter blue or a half blue because of the kudos it gives. And so the Blues committee had to meet from time to time to try and judge on this. And I think one of my abiding memories is that at one point, I'm sorry if Geeta's a foot beagler, but at one time we were asked to discuss whether foot beagling should constitute as a blue or a half blue sport. And we couldn't work this out. It was a lot of discussion and 1 or 2 pints to get to that point to say, well, it doesn't quite qualify as a full blue sport. Yeah.
What a wonderful, this sort of codifying, and then even now going to these things. Oh, foot beagler, question mark from Geeta.
A foot beagler. Well, yeah, so you chase the beagles like hunting dogs, aren't they? So you set a course across a field and the beagles go after it, and the men, women go after that. I don't quite see how it could be competitive.
No,
you could judge one group's success against another. But
yes.
I promise on my honor that we did discuss foot beagling.
and also, and a good question here: what was the mix, or was there a mix of social classes in the rugby, or the cricket teams?
Yeah, absolutely. Cambridge, has this reputation, sort of Brideshead Revisited type thing about your toffs and your languid upper classes, and there were a number of those. There were a number of. There was people from all classes, but there were 1 or 2 of the aristocratic levels, I suppose. Again, I've got one story about. I was in a history lecture with some guy, and he wanted some notes or he wanted something, and he said, "Just write to me, and I send them to me." And I said, "Well, address, name." He said, "Oh, Roxburgh." I said, "Okay, Roxburgh. Any more?" "Roxburgh Castle." So I thought, "Oh, Roxburgh." So Duncan Roxburgh Castle. Whereabouts is that? Roxburghshire. So I sort of again, that's a story I tell. I'm sure it happened.
No postcode.
Yeah.
So you were doing that. It says you retired from the sport in 1983. How old? I mean, was that a voluntary retirement? How old would you have been then?
I was 28. 28, yeah.
Is it early to retire? We've got
Well,
footballers of 30 something.
Possibly a result of trying to play rugby and cricket at the same time and not doing anything sensible like pre-season training or looking after yourself properly. I kept getting injuries. My first tour of Australia, I got an ankle injury which kept niggling away, and I had 5 or 6 ankle injuries in 6 or 7 years playing rugby.
Right.
And it started to interfere with the cricket, and I realised that I wasn't going to be able to reach the very top because my ankles just weren't good enough for a 5-day thing. So although I could play 3 days county cricket and did well enough, I was not really flourishing. I was doing okay, and I was probably keeping a younger, fitter bloke out of the side. And at the time, we just had our second baby. I felt I wanted to be a decent dad, not quite so absentee, because you're on the cricket circuit. You're away for most of the summer.
Yeah.
On the rugby circuit, you're away a lot. You've trained 2 or 3 times a week. So I wanted, but also I felt that it was time to sort out a career. In those days, again, if you're a rugby player, you did another career alongside. And rugby, if you play at a high level, takes time out. So you miss out on promotions. So you miss out on developing your career. And I felt with the combination of the injuries, my family, and the need to move on in a career, so that when I retired, I'd had a decent body of work behind me. I decided to go full-time teaching in 1983. Had already stopped playing rugby by then in 1980 because of the ankle injuries. And 2 years later, I was doing some broadcasting, and someone said, "Do you want to have a go at trying to work on the radio?" So that's how.
And was that being, because you become a top of the line sports presenter, basically? I mean, it must have been your competitive, hyperactive spirit doing that. But was that ever an ambition that you had?
Once somebody put it in front of me, it was. But luck, fortune. I was incredibly lucky that there was a rugby match in Bristol where I was teaching in the winter, and Ian Robertson, who'd been my coach at Cambridge, was the commentator, and they were let down by whoever was going to be the summariser. And somebody said, "Oh, Alastair Hignell lives up the road. He'll pop down." And Ian said, "Oh, yeah, I know him from past." And they put me in as the sort of second voice, and I enjoyed doing it. And then I did a few more. And somebody said, "Well, do you want to have a go at commentating?" And I said, "Well, why not? I can always go back to teaching. I can always try this again." And it clicked. I was able to show enough that I could commentate. And then I had a job. There were three positions or 4 positions for sports assistant in 1985 at the BBC Radio. Right. And John Inverdale was one.
Yeah.
Mark Saggers was there.
Yeah.
He went on to Sky. There's a commentator called Ian Brown, and myself. And these guys had real knowledge of radio and local radio and sport and how it all worked. I had knowledge of sport. I had zero knowledge of radio. But the guys, the people in the sports department said, "We'll take a chance that we can teach you how to do radio. But we like the fact that you know a little bit about rugby and a little bit about cricket." So that was the gamble. That was the exchange. And again, maybe the competitiveness or the willingness to learn or whatever. I got into. They were a fantastic bunch, the BBC Radio sports people. Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic job, and when and it still is. I mean, when you hear the BBC being knocked like it is every day now, what do you feel, Alastair?
Well, I think it's unfortunate and sad and wrong. I think the BBC have made some mistakes in that they've chased the common denominator. Perhaps they haven't stuck to their values. The values that made the BBC great and brilliant and the forerunner were very, you could call them Victorian values, but there was a certain integrity and honesty, and we do this because we are the best, we are the profession. So there was a sense of keeping up the high standards of having that integrity. I wouldn't say then they lack integrity now, but I think the BBC has tried to be too competitive, and possibly that's inevitable, but it's chasing ratings, that sort of thing, instead of saying, let's do what we do extremely well and let the others chase us, let the others try and follow us and compete with us in the way in which we cover a news story, the way in which we cover sports, our sense of decency or whatever it is, let them follow us. And I think if I was being very critical, I'd say the BBC have tended to go a little bit the other way, chasing things too much.
Chasing others.
And the reputation still around the world for the BBC and what they offer is still extremely high.
And we're not really controversial on Goldster, but I have to ask you this question. I mean, when you read about Gary Lineker's salary of doing Match of the Day, what do you think about that?
Well, good luck to him. I mean, if you or your agent can negotiate a salary, whatever, good luck to you. I'm afraid I was always a foot soldier at the BBC, and I tend to say, they say, this is the salary, there you go. And I go, oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So I didn't really have an agent or a high opinion of myself to say I need more or demand more. But yeah, I think that, again,
I think you're right there. I mean, a sort of semi-mentor of mine and colleague, Martin Bell, who became very famous for, he never once asked for a pay rise in the BBC. He just, whatever they offered him, he took, and then he went off and had a fantastic career.
Yeah.
So it's as you were, your whole life that you've described to us so brilliantly, and your successes and your ambition, and in fact, I think before I go into the detail of that, we have another question from Gita that says, "Are you hyperactive? Do you ever feel exhausted?"
Well, I must admit, my parents tell tales of when I was a young toddler, and I apparently had a tricycle, and I drove it around the yard, even though it was snowing, and my mum and dad kept saying, come on in, it's cold, it's snowing, and so on. And for some reason in my little head, I was going to do this, and the snow piled up and I was still pedaling away. So I had this sort of need to get energy expended. And I think was always brilliant at school, and there was always a rugby match, there was always a kick around at football, there was always something to get your energy expended, and
get across the line. Yeah.
So I spent some of my holidays just kicking a ball around against somebody's garage wall. They must have been at the garage door. They must have been incredibly upset. Every day this little lad is bashing a ball against his door. Goodness sake, shut up! But that's the thing. And I had a slip catcher, one of those nets where you throw a cricket ball and it bounces back, and I would spend hours every day throwing that and diving and catching, and all this thing. So yeah, I did realize early on, and my parents certainly realized I had this energy that needed to be expended, hopefully in the right directions.
I think on behalf of the Goldster Health Service, I'll diagnose that as hyperactive at the moment, because the next question I have for you is, you then hit MS, didn't you? You then got diagnosed. What is MS and what happened?
Well, MS is multiple sclerosis. It's a disease, it's a disorder of the central nervous system, which means that the nerves which send the messages from brain to organs, hands, whatever, and so on, they're encased in a little sheath, a myelin sheath. And with MS, that myelin sheath gets eroded a bit. So the nerve messages don't go down a straight pathway. They sometimes fire off in different directions, and they sometimes don't have the strength to do what your brain is telling you. Lift your arm up. So I can show you. I can do this very easy, but this one I'm using exactly the same brain message. Lift your arm up. I can get it to there. This one, this one's fine. So that's where the messages are impeded. The joined up electrical circuitry or whatever of sending messages at huge rates of knots to tell your brain or your body to do something are impeded, affected by multiple sclerosis. It's usually shown by, they call it sclerosis because of scars which are on your brain. You can just see little spots which interfere with the passageway of messages and electrical circuits and so on.
How old were you, and how did you know?
Well, I was 43.
Yeah.
In the 2 years previously, I'd started to experience lots of different but unconnected symptoms. I had a hip replacement operation when I was in 97, so I was still very young when I had it, because both my dad and grandma had hip operations, so there's a little bit of familial stuff. And yes, I hold up my hand. I probably bashed myself around quite a lot as a young sportsman, but I had a hip operation. We resumed walking. Our family was very keen on walking holidays. I resumed walking, but I suddenly found myself tripping up, and the right foot wouldn't clear the ground, and that seemed a bit of a surprise. So I went through various physios and acupuncture and chiropractors and so on. What's wrong with my right leg? Why is it not working? I blamed the hip specialist. I said, he's done a terrible job. He sent me a message saying, I have not done a terrible job. This is actually one of the best. Come and look at the x-ray. You'll see it's one of the best hip operations you've ever seen. So, but my foot wasn't working. My leg wasn't working. The hand was getting a numbness. Bladder, I had troubles with my bladder. They call it, with MS, it's a sort of, they call it the keyhole thing, or the thing you get yourself to the door with your key, and suddenly your bladder said, no, we should be at the toilet by now. So you can get yourself into all sorts of problems. So I had that. I had bladder issues, nerves, tingling, and leg, and went to the doctor each time. And eventually she said, look, you better go to the hospital where we'll do a proper scan. And they do a proper scan, MRI scan. And the guy said, yeah, there's an eye test, there's a photo something test showing how your eyes react. There's a lumbar puncture, and the three together, he said, yeah, you've got MS. And that was at 43, and didn't know what had hit me.
I mean, you say didn't know what had hit you, but you were hit. Did you go into, how did you pick yourself up from that?
It was a diagnosis. I knew good and bad, in that my cousin I knew he'd had MS, or he had MS, and nothing, he just felt tired from time to time, was exhausted, but his body seemed to work okay. He was okay. His brain was okay. So I said, I'll have that one. A friend of mine from university, his wife had MS, and she had died with MS, galloping primary progressive MS. So I said, I don't want that bit of MS. I'll have
the other bit.
You get told, and after the diagnosis, I don't know how doctors can do it better, but you get told you've got MS. I was told on a Friday. I went back and did my primitive stuff on the internet. And it's a progressive, incurable disease. You could be bedridden within 5 years. You're going to be in a wheelchair. The gloom and doom was incredible, because I didn't know anybody who had MS or had any handicap, really.
And you had, I mean, it wasn't as if an accountant had got it or something like that. You were the most active, successful. Your body was your mark. I mean, for your body not to work must have been a huge thing.
It was, I mean, like I sometimes say, when you play sport at the highest level, you ask your body to do extraordinary things, like tackle a great big 18-stone bloke, or face a fast bowler at 90 miles an hour. You're asking your body to go through a whole series of complicated things. When at various times with MS, I can't do my top button up in my shirt, so you can't even get your body to do ordinary things now. So there was a huge blow to the psyche, to be told, you're this fit, sporty guy, you're in sport, you're doing all this, sport is your milieu, to then go, actually, it probably won't be for, according to the worst case scenario, 5 years you'll be in a wheelchair, sort of stuff. That was a real blow.
This was, though, 20 or 25 years ago,
1999. January the 8th, 1999 was when I was
so are you, I mean, 5 years, I mean, I can see in the background looks like a walker thing. But our conversation has been funny, witty. Your arms have gone most of the way up. I mean, is it deteriorating? What's happening?
Yeah, I am getting worse slowly, but I think I don't know. Every individual is different. I've spent a long time analyzing myself, going to counseling, getting an understanding of what's happening to me, how it affects me, how it affects my family, how it affects my job, and all those sort of things. And one thing I must say straight away is that your family is affected when you've got something like this. And my wife was absolutely incredible. She was away on a work trip when I was diagnosed. She came back on a Monday morning, and I said, "Got some bad news for you, darling. I've got MS." And the first thing she said, "It's not yours, it's ours." And she's lived that with me ever since. So whatever problems we've had with walking, with traveling, driving, whatever else, she's been with me and helping me. And we've taken on everything together. And you need people around you. That's one thing that I would, if there's one abiding message, is you can't take it alone. You need people around you. You need people to support. And I've been blessed to have this fantastic wife, who's Jeannie, who's just been fantastic for me and shared everything with me. And
there was an earlier question. I'm not going to from is that your wife, is she sporty?
My wife is a personal trainer. She trains people. She's never been conventionally sporty. She was one of 4 daughters, and she grew up in a non-sporty environment. So, but she's always been incredibly interested in fitness, keeping fit, health, body, diet, that sort of thing. And since we moved to Brighton, she has set up not a business, even that, but she trains people on the seafront 3 times a week. She takes on personal clients just to help them with personal balance issues or knee issues. And we are finding, the older we get, that we all got a little niggle here, a little niggle with your knee, or or my arches have fallen, and she helps people using exercise and encouragement and diet and so on to make the best of getting older, which is
brilliant.
what it's all about. She trains older adults, and 3 times a week they go down onto the Brighton seafront, and in all weathers. I'm not so sure about tomorrow, but in all weathers, she takes them down onto the seafront, and they do, call it age-appropriate exercise, but exercise that helps them to be the best versions of themselves that they can be.
Well, that's very much the Goldster message, isn't it?
Absolutely.
As the sort of things start creaking a bit, to fix them so they don't take over your life. Jean Shandley asked, was the MS a result of playing rugby? No.
People without MS, people who never played rugby got MS. It's a disease, a malfunction of the nervous system. There's no link with MS. It's vaguely hereditary, although nobody in my family had it. My sons, I've got a 1 in 1,000 greater chance of getting it than they might have had, because they're the sons of somebody with MS. No, it is just a malfunction, I think, of the nervous system. We can't put it. I mean, there's a lot of research putting it this MND down to rugby bashing and rugby injuries and head knocks and that sort of thing.
But it's not.
There's no evidence that would suggest that
you can't
rugby or cricket or anything, or like I had anything to do with that.
Geeta says, I'm going to wrap this into a question. I'm going to share your question, Geeta. Are you a member of a support group? And tell us, who are Higgie's heroes, Alastair?
Right. Yes, I am a member of, well, I've tried since I've diagnosed. I just felt that I wanted to help anybody with MS, people going through the same thing that I've gone through. So I have been a patron of various MS charities, and one of those was called MS UK. And go back a bit further, sorry. When I was diagnosed, some friends of mine from all around the world showed their love, generosity, support, and tried to raise some money. A bunch of my Cambridge mates who were in their 50s and really should have known better said, let's run the London Marathon for multiple sclerosis. And we're running it for Higgy, which is my sporting nickname. And we sort of coined the idea that they were Higgie's heroes. So they ran the London Marathon as Higgie's heroes. And I was living in Stroud at the time, and the local sports journalist said, can we have Higgie's heroes in Stroud? And I said, well, yeah, of course you can. And so 130 people in Stroud became Higgy's heroes, largely because my wife pestered them. Anybody who came to fix the ceiling or whatever. No, not true. A lot of our friends just said, yeah, we want to run the Stroud half marathon as Higgy's heroes. And we ended up with 138, I think it was, people calling themselves Higgy's heroes, running the Stroud half marathon to raise money for the MS UK. And that was just the most humbling, beautiful and wonderful experience.
Yes.
People should want to do that in my name. So I was really
and you continued working with the BBC for so many years after that, didn't you? After your diagnosis.
Yeah. I kept going until 2008. 2007 was the last World Cup in France, so that's whatever, right. 16 or so years ago. And I'd been diagnosed in 99. I'd gone on a couple of tours, and one of the things about working as the daily reporter, journalists, whatever, with the team that's on tour at a World Cup is that you're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in case something happens, and you have to do the commentaries, and you have to do the traveling, and you have to really be on top of your game. I found that after I did a few tournaments and World Cups, but after a while, I just found that so draining, so physically demanding that when I would get home, my wife would take the biggest brunt. I'd just come and collapse and need a few weeks to recover. And it wasn't going to get any better. I was not going to do it as well as I wanted to. So I just, again, with counseling, I decided that I would try and say goodbye to being a commentator and embrace whatever the rest of my life would hold for me. So we made a decision, as I say, very good counseling about, because my identity was Higgy the sportsman.
Exactly.
What's it going to be now? But we started to say goodbye to it. I think I've got a fair way along the way. I still get frustrated at times, but we've worked out a way of moving on with it rather than against it.
Stay there for a second, because I'm going to tell everybody what is coming up on Inside Story. You're going to tell us what's coming up on PPG again, but on November the 2nd, which I think is this week or next week, Lucinda with Wendy Moore, Endell Street, the women who ran Britain's trailblazing military hospital. November the 3rd, Lucinda with Shelley Powers and Elvis Remembered. That's stories and interviews with the heartthrob singers, friends and others. November the 9th, I'm with J.R. Seeger. He is the author of the Mike 4 spy military thrillers, and he led one of the first CIA missions into Afghanistan after 9/11. And November the 14th, I'm with Billy Kulk, who is the lead singer of Led Zepp, the most successful Led Zeppelin tribute band. You can hear all about his stories of playing with stars like Ozzy Osbourne, Robert Plant and others. And being a star himself, he fills halls all over the world. Halls, I should say, concert venues. November the 16th, we have a very special day. Lucinda is with the wonderful Bonnie Greer. You can join Bonnie and Lucinda on Zoom, but also you can go to a live audience at Kensington Riverstone by emailing Joe Carter Hawkins at goldster.co.uk. There's going to be an inside story, and then Bonnie is going to give a talk and just conversation after lunch in the afternoon. And November 24th, my book of the month is Jonathan Livingston's Seagull. Read it, talk about it, love it, or maybe hate it, but come and join that discussion. Alastair, who have you got coming up next on PPG?
Well, I was hoping you weren't going to ask me that. I've got some letters that are in the post, as it were, and emails are on the way, but haven't had an acceptance as yet. I think I'm doing the 18th and the 25th of November, but I've got some very good people in receipt of my emails and expecting to.
You have had some fantastic people on, I must say, the whole sort of sporting genre that you can gather. And I just want to ask you a couple of Goldster questions to the end. Sport on the field, when do you know when to take the risk and go for it? That ball that'll never get across the line, or the ball that you could never hit for a six? Give us the thought process.
You have to have done it a lot. I mean, muscle memory is very important, but I think the key thing is trust your instincts. Trust your instincts. This is the one I'm going to hit for six, or this is the one that is going to work. And because over the course of all the practice you've done, and there's all these theories about the 10,000 hours of practice, but you'll have experienced this before. So it's really a question of that's the decision you make. But if you go, oh, is this the one I hit for 6 or not? You have to just trust your instincts. You just have to go, this is it, because I know I can do it. If you've got any worries about your physical ability or your courage or anything else, it's going to be a problem. But if you've got all the other things there, trust yourself, go for it.
And a final one-line thought, if you get hit as you did with MS or anything, you've got a full active life and suddenly, boom, this thing happens, give us one line of how to get through it.
It's okay to ask for help.
That's a beautiful line. It's okay to ask for help. You have mentioned on a few times the support of your wonderful wife and also your friends and that sort of thing. Alastair, time's winged chariot attacks us. But we'll exchange some guests, actually. We had Corey Mapp on the other day. He had lost both his legs in Afghanistan and was now the bobsleigh England champion. So we must swap guests as Goldster presented. But what a great show. Goldster's very own Alastair Hignell today, giving us wonderful stories from childhood until today, until Lucinda on November the 2nd. I've forgotten what Wendy Moore and Endell Street. That's it. Stay involved. Stay curious. Keep interacting. Keep reading. Don't worry about asking for help. And of course, stay Goldster. Alastair Hignell, thank you very much for giving us such a wonderful Goldster conversation. Really, really lovely. Thanks.
Absolute pleasure, Humphrey. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Alastair. Bye, everybody.